Well, thanks everyone for coming. I wanted to tell you that this might be a little different than some of the presentations that you're accustomed to, because I've included things that surprised me along the way in terms of doing research on the Buffalo Soldiers in Garfield. And this particular painting is one of the things that I came across and was quite surprised by. And we'll get back to the story of that painting. And the painting is done by this man, came to Tucson in the 1980s. He was a specialist in landscapes and he did some architecture, but he was not skilled in doing like portrait work. But he studied Frederick Remington. And some of you may have heard that name before. Remington is well known for the Western art that he did. And so David decided he wanted to learn those techniques. We'll go back to that first slide after this kind of presentation. So the presentation includes a slice of military, Buffalo Soldier, homesteader, and regional art history, which is where we begin. I start with this artist's work because he is the only artist in the last 50 years in the Tucson area who depicted Buffalo Soldiers, outside of the renowned artist Bob Vann. I don't know if many of you have heard, if anybody's into art. Bob Vann is the prominent African-American artist who has done extensive Buffalo Soldier work. His work is shown in the Pentagon, Fort Leavenworth, and in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Now, Bob actually lives in southern Arizona, but he doesn't make himself very accessible. He kind of sticks to himself. So I did not have access to Bob, but I had access to David's work. So 100 years after the Buffalo Soldiers arrived in the Arizona Territory, artist David Laughlin of Tucson began to research their presence in the area. He learned of their existence through his interest in the painting technique of well-known artist Frederick Remington. Remington, after being hired by Harper's Weekly, rode with the soldiers in the territory on a few occasions and then would send his artwork back east, and it was published in the Harper's Weekly. 40 years after Laughlin began his research, I arrived in Tucson. I didn't notice many black faces. And coming from the Midwest urban area, and I was born and raised in Detroit, the absence of black faces was noticeable to me. I asked a simple question: what is the history of blacks in this area? The answer was the Buffalo Soldiers were here starting with the Apache Wars in the 1870s. And this is how my research journey began. Unfortunately for me, David died in 2020 and I never got a chance to meet him. I did not learn of his work until 2021. A series of his prints called Military Hours had become a part of the new memorial to the Buffalo Soldiers in Tucson. When I saw the work, I inquired about possibly purchasing a print, and given the contact information for his daughter, who is still in the Tucson area. I went to meet her and asked about purchasing a print. She indicated that I could, and the question for me was the cost. I mean, I just wasn't quite sure whether I could afford to do that. And did I know that her father had done 15 years of research on the Buffalo Soldiers? I said, no, I certainly didn't. And she pointed over to the side of the room where there sat 10 banker boxes full of Buffalo Soldier research that he had done. So she allowed me to delve into his research. I saw drawings of the Buffalo Soldiers in Bonita Canyon in one of the Garfield Monument, and the one that we're going to take a look at again in a minute. So I was then on my way to the Chiricahua National Monument to talk about the history with a park ranger. So I want to go back to that because there's a funny story to me. Artist Laughlin, accustomed to doing renderings for architectural firms in Chicago, painted landscapes and created sculptures, but was not accustomed to doing portraits. So in the 1980s, he hired a black man in Tucson, whose name was Michael Ray Davis, to serve as his model when painting a soldier. This painting and the accompanying notes were found in David's research. I found it amusing that this paid model complained profusely about him having to wear this heavy wool uniform for so long during the month of July in Tucson. And if, I just came from there. It's September, but it was 103. So I can understand the complaint. But I think his act of having a model accurately reflects David's desire to get the features right. And the reason I think that's so important is because throughout history, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, some of the portraits, some of the facial features of blacks have been exaggerated, greatly exaggerated. So I think David really tried in this painting to get the facial features. The eyes are a little exaggerated, but I did check with some friends of mine in the Buffalo Soldiers group in Arizona to see if they thought there was anything wrong with this painting, and they thought it was just fine. So this is my favorite. My favorite David Laughlin painting of the Buffalo Soldiers in the southern Arizona Territory. David's technique was landscape, and to me, this is exactly what it looks like in southern Arizona. Some of the, just the hills. And here he shows the soldiers and their Indian scouts. And of interest to me, I knew nothing about the Indian Scouts. They were required to wear the red headband so they would not be mistaken for the enemy. So they have red headbands on. And the Indian Scouts played a big role in assisting the Army during the Apache Wars, much to the consternation of politicians in Washington, D.C. Some believed that the Scouts could not be trusted. But General George Crook, commander of the Arizona Territory Department at the time, believed that they were indispensable. The terrain in the area was rugged. The cavalry struggled in this area, and the Apache Scouts knew the area like the back of their hands. This issue would continue to be contentious until the end of the Geronimo campaign. I don't know how many of you know anything about the Geronimo campaign, but it took a while for him to surrender. And he was second to the last who surrendered. But General George Crook was resigned during the time that we're talking about when the Buffalo Soldiers were here. And Nelson Miles came in to take his place. In part, it was because D.C. was very unhappy with the fact that Geronimo had not been captured yet. But I love I love the paintings on this paint. So I don't know how many of you know anything about the Buffalo Soldiers. I'm going to go over some general facts, just in case you don't know. So who were the Buffalo Soldiers? This is a photo from the Library of Congress of a Buffalo soldier. He was assigned to the 25th Infantry, Troop A, and the reason I know that is because it's on his hat. Between 1884 and 1890, these uniforms, this was a sack jacket, and you can see that with the stripes on his arm, he was a sergeant. Maybe, I think that's a sergeant. And of course the black soldiers could not, pretty much were restricted to being sergeants. At this point had not gone to West Point. They were African American soldiers, many of whom had fought in the Civil War. After the Civil War, the Army it was greatly reduced in number, and Abraham Lincoln knew that he had to find a place for those soldiers. And so he created the Army Reorganization Act he created in 1866. It originally created 6 regiments, but within 3 years they were down to 4, 2 infantry and 2 cavalry. Now, things that they did, maybe some of you watch PBS, but they've had some different programs on the Buffalo Soldiers. So the Buffalo Soldiers went on to protect the Texas border with Mexico. They did, of course, battles with many Native American troops, starting in, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, Pacific Northwest. Pretty much all over the West. And the soldiers were involved with national wars in the Philippines. They were also fighting with Teddy Roosevelt at the time of the Spanish-American War. So today we're discussing Buffalo Soldiers assigned to the Southwest. How did the name Buffalo Soldiers come about? And again, this is still there's much controversy surrounding this. And of course, we don't have anybody to ask. But one of the main reasons that some of the books indicate is when the Native Americans saw the Buffalo Soldiers, they had never seen anybody black. And because of their hair, their tightly curled hair, the Native Americans thought that their hair looked much like the buffalo fur. So that's one. But the Buffalo Soldiers had a great reputation for being fierce fighters. And we know that the buffalo, prior to the Europeans coming out, the buffalo represented everything to the Native American tribes. They used every single part of that buffalo in order to survive. And the buffaloes were fierce fighters as well. So it could have been a reference to the fierce fighting part, or it could have been the hair. I will tell you that the Buffalo Soldiers did not embrace this name initially. It wasn't until after 1900 that you will see, and originally it was only assigned to the 10th Cavalry. And that's who we're talking about today, troops in the 10th Cavalry. Eventually, Buffalo Soldiers became all black soldiers, but the African Americans were pretty unhappy about being referred to as Buffalo Soldiers. They felt it was insulting. That turned around at some point. I cannot tell you why, but it was after 1900 when the buffalo then appears on their insignia for the 10th Cavalry. So that's all I know about that name. So this is where, I don't know how any of you ever been to southern Arizona in the south of Tucson? Now, a lot of people will go to Grand Canyon, Flagstaff, Sedona, I'm naming all those places and a little farther north. But I wanted to show you how close this was to the Mexican border and in New Mexico. This is the Chiricahua Mountains. Very close to the international border. Of course, it was the international border, but the Apaches did not consider it a border. This was their homeland for thousands of years. So all of this land, previously part of Mexico, sold the United States, was a part of Apache land. Chiricahua Mountains sit in the southeastern corner of Arizona, 60 miles north of what is currently the Mexican border, and 20 miles west of the New Mexico state line. It is the longest in what they call, quote unquote, Sky Island mountain range in the state. These are isolated mountains surrounded by radically different lowland environments. And when the Southwest region years and years ago began warming and the temperatures increased substantially, vast deserts were formed that isolated the mountains. And so if you're going desert, 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 and all of a sudden there are the mountains, but a lot of flat land at the time. Historically, it is a former home of the Chiricahua Apache people, and there are any number of bands of Apaches. There are still the White Mountain Apaches in the northern area, farther north. But this was the Chiricahua's Apaches. So they had been in the area for thousands of years when the European settlers started arriving. And this is the Arizona map, so you can see where we're discussing. But placing the Buffalo Soldiers in the area during the Apache Wars was not their only time close to the Mexican border. During Mexican insurgencies, which there were a number of against the federal government, 25 years after the Apache Wars, between 1900 and 2020, and 1900 and 1925, there were 30 camps along the southern Arizona border that were guarding during the Mexican insurgencies so that the Mexican insurgents could not take. There was mining, there was cattle, they didn't want those all going to Mexico with the insurgency. So there were hundreds of Buffalo Soldiers on the southern border. In fact, I tell people, and I didn't know any of this, so I was quite a novice. Between World War I and II, there were 25,000 African American soldiers who trained at Fort Huachuca. I mean, it was just an incredibly large number. I was pretty stunned by that. So that area, and Fort Huachuca has a Buffalo Soldier Museum. Any of you might be interested in that. So this is what they look like. If you have not been, these are the hoodoos. This is, I don't know if we have any geologists in the area, but this is the way the mountains formed over millions of years, and they're quite distinct. And they formed, and then between the wind and the rain, this is what they look like. It is pretty startling. I have to tell you, I almost drove off the road the first time. I was so startled by how different they looked. This is one of David Laughlin's drawings of Camp Bonita, obviously a line drawing, based on all of his years of research. And I will tell you, there was also a cultural landscape report that was done in the 1980s that helped David and me determine what that camp looked like logistically, where were things. So the study was done in 1983, and the report from that study outlines in great detail what the camp must have looked like based on the survey's findings. Many artifacts were found which confirmed where certain parts of the camp were located. And there's controversy among researchers about whether that chimney would have been part of the tent. This was a temporary encampment. Generally, that wouldn't have been, you wouldn't have had a chimney. But this was not a temporary encampment that we're talking about today in the traditional sense, because they were in that camp for 7 months, not 7 weeks. So it's possible that the chimney was built, but there are still people who don't believe that that would have been there. And you see in the background where the horses, there were 2 troops that were there most of the 7 months. And altogether there were 100 horses. So that little stable thing in the back would not have been nearly enough, but it was a large encampment. And so you know this guy. And so when I started doing my research, I ended up at the Chiricahua National Monument and talked to a park ranger. And she said, well, you know, the Buffalo Soldiers were here and they built a monument to President Garfield. And I said, oh, no, I didn't know, and why would they do that? That was my overriding question as I continued the research and Part of it was because I didn't know anything about President Garfield, and none of my friends do either. I've done a survey, and none of them knew that. Oh, he was assassinated, wasn't he, Sharon? Yeah, he was. That is the Laughlin drawing. We're going to talk about the soldiers first. A couple things about Buffalo soldiers in general. Half of the black men who joined the regular army in the 1860s, after 1866, had served in the Civil War. 500 transferred directly from the United States Colored Troops regiments to the new army. And after the act was signed, these men became the veterans who helped offset the shortages of educated men in the ranks of the new regiments, and furnished experienced comrades for recruits fresh from civilian life. They referred, and the term they used then, and this was back in the 1880s, they all referred to themselves and each other as colored men. And having these experienced soldiers was really important for the Army to function. I mean, they needed people who were literate. And so many of the soldiers who came into the Army at this point were illiterate. This is the first time in Army history that they assigned chaplains to the 4 regiments. And they had chaplains assigned previously to locations, but they didn't have chaplains assigned to specific troops. This time, one of the things, and I'm not sure, I would have to read Garfield congressional speeches a little bit better, but one of the issues is the education issue. And so one of the requirements was that the chaplains also had to be the teachers. And if black soldiers wanted to move up to first and second sergeant, they had to be literate. So that was a little incentive, but these were people who did not have any literacy to speak of, who came into the Army. So 2 troops of H and E of the 10th Cavalry, the original Buffalo soldiers, spent 7 months in the canyon from October of 1885 to May 1st of 1886. Their presence was part of the Water Hole campaign. In total, there were 60 to 100 soldiers in camp there. And the purpose of the Water Hole campaign, and this was still under General George Crook, was to have troops in Apache territory along the creeks and rivers in the Chiricahua Mountains to prevent Geronimo, hiding in the mountains in Mexico, from gaining access to water. Should he and his people surreptitiously return to the area, they and their horses would not have access to water. And the strategy worked. So the captain of Troop H was Charles Cooper. And in regard to the fact that you've had mostly Civil War lectures, Charles Cooper was a former Civil War private and sergeant, and he served at Gettysburg. He was a 2nd lieutenant of the United States Colored Troops, number 127. So this is different. His wife and daughter, Forrestine Cooper, came from Fort Grant in Arizona to stay with him when it appeared that this was going to be more than a temporary short detachment. Obviously, you would not have family with you. The officers would not have their families with them when there was temporary encampments. But this was going to be longer, and it was going to be over the winter. So the Coopers stayed in a 2-room cabin for which they paid a squatter $50. That was a lot of money back then, I think. That the captain was able to have his family at a temporary encampment is also a matter of controversy. However, we can affirm that they were in the canyon through the words of the captain's daughter, Forrestine Cooper Hooker, who wrote a memoir, Child of the Fighting Tenth, which was published in 2003. 70 years after her death, she had finished 2/3 of the manuscript, and her family kept it. And Oklahoma Press was able to capture that manuscript and finish it. But her memoir describes in great detail some of the terrain, the cabin itself, horseback riding in the canyon, and various events that happened at that camp. So you'd have to say her memoir was fabricated in order to, or her father told her all these things and she wrote them down. I tend to believe that they were in that area with the soldiers just because of the level of detail. And this was another, remember I told you in the beginning, there was surprises along the way. And the fact that she became an author was a goldmine for me. She talks about, she wrote novels, and she wrote 9 novels. And one of them was When Geronimo Wrote, and it's an old, I had to get it from Abe Books, or, I had to buy a archival copy. So she wrote these novels and all about her time, her father's and her time with the 10th. She was about 9 months old when her father started with the 10th. And except for her school, going to school, this was her family. So it's pretty interesting. They had a very different relationship. I read in some of my reading, some of the books I read, that the white officers often had a different relationship with the black soldiers because the black soldiers, there were fewer desertions, and they were easier. They didn't have as many infractions as the white soldiers. And if you think about it, you have to look at the times. What employment options were there for blacks at the time? Laborers, porters, maybe. But so this was, and I learned this from some of the Garfield material I read. They earned $13 a month, just like the white soldiers. And there was a question when the legislation was going through for the Reorganization Act, whether they should be paid the same. But they ended up being paid the same. So they were. Did they have problems during their military service? Oh my God, yes. The captains and Benjamin Grierson, who was the head of the 10th, was treated very badly by other generals. But they made it through. There were no lieutenants in this camp, as they were assigned to other troops in Mexico, searching for Geronimo. But no black troops were sent to Mexico. There were several non-commissioned sergeants among the black soldiers, and Troop H had a reputation for discipline and decorum. Some of the sergeants had been in the military for multiple tours of duty, so this is where that being older, meaning they were in their 30s, but they were able to take the younger, the ones who were signing up at the age of 21, kind of under their belt, and the younger soldiers respected the older black soldiers. They were seasoned, and the enlistees respected them. Captain Cooper said he was happy when he was assigned leadership of Troop H. He eventually became a brigadier general, and of note, maybe people in the room, he died in Worthington, Ohio in 1919. So, I started doing more research on who else died in Ohio, there were many more than I knew, people from the state who have served in different capacities. So the soldiers were from 15 states. The 5 that enlisted in Ohio, most of them enlisted in Cincinnati, which I think would make sense given the location. But 2 had enlisted in Cleveland. And I thought it might be kind of interesting. I pulled this information out for you. We know a little about them, just a little. Records on these soldiers are sparse. There you go. And we can generally see small details in their if they applied for a pension. No photos were available. Only cards completed during their enlistment with indications of skin color and any visible scars. So on one of their little cards you might see, as I did on one of the soldiers I'm doing research on from Detroit, he was designated along the side of his card as mulatto. Each of these two privates had been in the military for a few years when the entire 10th Cavalry left Fort Davis, Texas, heading to their new home in the Arizona Territory. And to this day, it just boggles my imagination as to what they must have thought upon seeing the desert, the real desert, the first time. I mean, you had people coming from Philadelphia, from Florida, from DC, and so I'm sure the desert was kind of startling for them. And I also, this is the biggest wonder that I have. 10th Cavalry, the whole cavalry, 12 troops strong, approximately 700 plus soldiers, riding in formation along the Southern Pacific Railroad line between Texas and Arizona. I mean, it just 700. I mean, that's just kind of, that's the number. Each of the troops were supposed to have 100, but they were never at full strength. So this is the one person from Cleveland. Solomon Bowler was born into slavery in Virginia and enlisted in the Army in Cleveland on July 26, 1882. He had been employed as a laborer in his years before military service. He was discharged from the Army in 1887, so he spent 5 years in cavalry, 1 term of duty. If you were in cavalry, you had to serve 5 because it took them a year to teach you about horses. So they had to serve a term of 5. In his pension records, he complained of lifelong respiratory problems he developed in Bonita Canyon when he was shoeing horses in the rain and sometimes with snow, quote unquote, snow up to his knees. So this is about 5,000 feet up. The Chiricahuas go as high as close to 10,000, but the soldiers were at 5. Despite these problems, Mr. Bowler lived a long life and died at the age of 90 in Los Angeles. Peter Dehoney was born right after the end of the Civil War in Kentucky. He enlisted at Cleveland on November 8, 1882, and was in the service for 10 years. After his service, he lived in North Dakota and Minnesota and died in Minneapolis and was buried in the military cemetery there in 1951. He was 86. Charles Faulkner, who this novelist Forestine Cooper Hooker described as someone of literary note, Charles Faulkner, was born into slavery in Kentucky in 1850 and enlisted in the Army in Cincinnati 1879, which makes sense at Kentucky, Cincinnati. He was one of the older soldiers at Bonita, meaning he was in his 30s. He had been promoted to sergeant in 1881 and served in the Army for 28 years, a total of 8 enlistments. Now, this particular person that I'm coming up to next is not Ohio, but someone I have done a lot of research on. His name is Michael Finnegan. And when I talked to the park ranger about the Garfield Monument and the Buffalo Soldiers, I asked her, anybody here from Detroit? And she said, I don't know, Sharon, go and look at their website. Their website, by the way, has done a really nice job. They have a roster of the soldiers. But again, because there weren't a lot of records back then, I'm grateful for the roster because I was able to take certain names and do some research on them. But Michael enlisted in Detroit in 1884 at Fort Wayne, and that's not Fort Wayne, Indiana. That's Fort Wayne, Detroit. Detroit had a fort. He was 21, and after his cavalry training in Missouri, he went straight to Fort Davis, Texas. He served 2 terms of duty and became Forresting Cooper's bodyguard when she went horseback riding while in Bonita Canyon. And the reason, again, another serendipitous thing that happened was when I found out about Forresting's book that she had written about the fighting tent, I went and purchased it and went to the index in the back just knowing that my Michael Finnegan was not going to be named there, and sure enough, there he was. He was in the index, and she talks about him being her bodyguard. So there were ranchers in the area within 5 miles, and she started on horses when she was 4. And so she loved horses, and of course, she's not going to be horseback riding there by herself. And so Michael Finnegan, he might have been working with the horses at the time. I have no idea why Captain Cooper chose him, but Michael apparently was thrilled. It was a little different duty for him, and I think they had a good relationship. But this time in the canyon for him may have been his best in the military. He never married, nor did he have children, and he had to seek post-military employment as an able-bodied seaman on a British merchant ship. So he sought employment outside of the United States, but his timing was bad as World War I was starting, and the Germans tried to torpedo his ship, throwing him into the water. He was actually one of the few that survived, and along with his military records. So he struggled to get any kind of a pension, and he died in a VA home when he was in his 50s. So it's kind of sad. You see, some people live to their 90s. Some of the soldiers lived to their 90s. He only lived in his 50s. So this is the Garfield Monument. It would be the backside. So you will see as we go on that the other side, which would have faced the mountains, has a lot of stones, engraved stones on it. But this is exactly what the monument looked like originally. So this monument came to be in the winter of 1886. We don't know why the soldiers spent their time this way, but it's clear they spent a significant amount of time and effort to doing this. And they wanted it to be a handsome structure. That's my terminology. 60 stones have engraved letters on them or designs. The Laughlin sketch is the only rendering we know of that depicts what the Garfield Monument looked like in its original form. 2 records remain which describe the original monument. One is a description from a Tombstone newspaper article from 1893, 7 years after the Buffalo soldiers left. And here is a quote from the Tombstone newspaper. The stone monument erected last winter by men of H Troop, cavalry, colored, to the memory of the late President Garfield exists. The monument, which is of stones squared in quite workmanlike manner and built with some pretensions to architectural design, is about 18 feet high, 10 feet at the base. On it is a suitable inscription, and on many of the stones are names of some of the men who built the monument. Over the years, you could see in 1890, which would have been just really 4 years after the soldiers left, on the left, there are two of us who have researched this issue. Neither of us know who this black man is. And we've tried all the archival, all the Arizona Historical Society, everything. We can't find out, but it's possible. We have a couple possibilities. But look at how tall. I always maintain that this monument was only 10 feet tall. But that couldn't be. If you see this man sitting here, maybe he's 6 feet, another 6 feet. I mean, it would have been more than 10 feet. So that's 1890. Now in 1910, and I think this is one of the, I don't know if you could see it from there, in the middle you see the big stone with Garfield's, yeah, it's in the middle. Can you see the name Garfield in that one? It's the biggest stone. It's hard. I mean, this was taken 30 years after. So this is the side that faces the north, and there's the first indication of the tribute to Garfield. And the unidentified man, we can speculate that this man, possibly Sergeant Horton, because they're all speculation, who tried mightily to get the United States Army to preserve this monument years after he left the service. The Army did respond by sending someone to look at the remains of the structure. But they reported back that it looked like the remnant of a Sibley oven. Did not look like a monument at all. Also of interest, the Garfield family was contacted in the 1890s, and it is unclear from the records if they responded in the negative or that they didn't respond. So 2 attempts were made to preserve this monument, in part because the homesteader, the Swedish homesteader who moved into this area was Neil Erickson, and he was in the 4th Cavalry, and he wanted desperately for the Army to preserve it. And when it became clear that they were not going to, as his kids grew up, they begged him to bring the stones inside so that there wouldn't be any more vandalism, that there would at least be some stones left. So this is the Lillian and Ed Riggs dismantled this monument, and they used the stones for their fireplace in the Faraway Ranch. Now, the top you can see what's left of the flagpole. That's in the 1920s. That's pretty high flagpole. And you can see that there's a fence. So when the efforts were made to put in a road, I believe that's when this fence went in. And also, to some extent, it does, keep people from taking some of these stones. So here's the last photo of the monument in the place where it was originally erected. You can see it was taken from high up, and you can see the stones around the base. And this is when the children of Neil Erickson convinced him to take the rest of the stones and bring them into their home. So there would have been a lot of activity around this area with the Swedish homesteaders, the Ericksons. They had a substantial spread of land and cattle. They had a lot of property. So daughter Lillian and her sister subsequently started a guest ranch called the Faraway Ranch on this property. In this photo from the higher elevation, you can see in the distance the monument, where this is where it would have been like the parade field for the Buffalo soldiers. This would have been whatever they were doing, exercises with their horses, that would have been where they would have done it. And this is the last photo we have of it intact. After this time, the monument would be dismantled and get a second life. So here are some of the stones. And you can see the different engravings and the extent to which people might have put time into them. Like the one in the middle on the bottom, Logan. I mean, that's a little bit more elaborate carving or engraving. And then you just have someone over on the, you have the W on the left. These were, I mean, these photos were taken a long time after that structure was dismantled. Now on the top middle, MWF, that's my guy. That's Michael Finnegan. And the three interlocking circles under that, anybody know what that represents? It's a social group. It's the Odd Fellows. So Michael probably could have very well been or had friends who were members of the Odd Fellows. There is also another stone for the Masons. And at this time in history, blacks had to form their own, they had to get a charter. The charter for the Odd Fellows had to come from England because the United States Odd Fellows would not allow blacks to have either join or to have their own group. So they went directly to the England where the charters originated and they got their own charter. So I think this tells us Buffalo soldiers were trying to, kind of give us a clue, what their lives were like, their civilian lives were like. This is the Faraway Ranch new dining room. This is when they had the guest dining room. You can see, I hope that photo at the top is the best we could do with on the Garfield, tribute to Garfield. But you can see that's a nice size fireplace. And putting that over the mantle, and then 48 of the stones went into this fireplace, and the rest of them were put out in the chimney on the outside. So the only thing that you can see now is the chimney on the outside. So this fireplace, it sits on the north side of the ranch. In 1977, the ranch was acquired by the National Park Service from the Erickson family and became the Faraway Ranch Historic District, with tours starting to be conducted in the 1980s. Unfortunately, asbestos had to be removed from the ranch, and that process started about 3 years ago. Not clear when tours will be allowed again. Until that time, people will only be able to see the photos of the interior on the website and the stones on the exterior of the chimney. So where are we today? This is what the Faraway Ranch looks like today. Now, what's kind of interesting is, it's kind of hard to imagine too, is the side we're looking at where the stairs are, the side we're looking at is where Captain Cooper and his family lived, he and his daughter and his wife, although it was 2 rooms, it was a cabin. It was probably a log cabin. When the Ericksons moved in, Neil was a carpenter. So Neil started building on. They already had a daughter. They had 2 more children. So the 2-room cabin began to expand, and first the dining room and then another living area. The second floor and the steps, of course, were put in when the guest ranch started. And then Lillian's husband could do electrical work, so then they got plumbing and electricity. So, where are we at today? More attention is being given to the military history of black soldiers prior to the integration of the troops in 1948. Military historian Dr. John Langelier has written a book tentatively entitled More Work Than Glory, and it will be published in November. And that reference is to the fact that the the Buffalo Soldiers did a lot of work. If you've seen any of the PBS specials they literally built the roads in the original national parks. And they put up telegraph wires. I mean, they did a lot of manual labor. So John Langelier, he was also the lead investigator for the National Park Service study on Black military history in the national parks, which was submitted to the National Park Service last September. Number 3, a centennial commemoration of the Chiricahua National Monument is being held in 2024, next year. There will be several events over the course of the year, including a Buffalo Soldier / Garfield Monument Day. The Cochise County Historical Society and the Southwest Buffalo Soldier Association will be participating in the planning, as will I. I don't know if anybody's aware, there are a number of Buffalo Soldier organizations today in the United States. And, you know, maybe because the Buffalo Soldiers had to serve west of the Mississippi, I think that, you know, kind of diminishes the amount of information we have east of the Mississippi. But there are 10th and 9th and 10th Cavalry associations in Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado. We have 3 or 4 Buffalo Soldier, and what they do, they present colors at funerals. They present the flags. They go into the schools. They're trying to preserve this history. And they go into the schools and talk to young people about the Buffalo Soldiers. So we do have 2 groups in southern Arizona, and we have another in Phoenix. Some of them are motorcycle riders. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I mean, it's to see them in uniform riding those motorcycles is pretty impressive. There's 2 different groups, though. There's a motorcycle group and then the non-motorcycle group. And my understanding, I had to ask a lot of questions when I first started researching. And originally, in order to be in the Buffalo Soldier Association, you had to be retired military. But then over time, they changed that. People wanted to join who didn't have military experience. So then they have a non-military, and I don't know if those are the motorcycle riders or not. But they do exist. I believe in Philadelphia, they have a Buffalo Soldier organization. So I am personally, along with my Cochise County Historical Society and the Garfield and the Southwest Association of Buffalo Soldiers, proposing a wayside sign for the Garfield Monument in partnership hopefully with the National Park Service. Now, this is a big endeavor, and because the centennial commemoration is going on next year at they're not talking about a wayside marker. There are wayside markers for the Faraway Ranch and the Erickson family, and they're all kind of lined up by the Faraway Ranch. But it would be great if we could honor the soldiers and President Garfield by having a wayside sign. A bipartisan group of legislators from Arizona, including Senators Kelly, Sinema, and Representative Juan Ciscomani, whose district includes the Chiricahua National Monument, have sponsored a bill to make the Chiricahua National Monument a national park. If that was to happen, it would showcase a very rich history of southeastern Arizona, which would include the Buffalo Soldiers and the building of the Garfield Monument, and also the rich history of the Apaches in that area. I have several people where I live who say, hey, I went to the Chiricahua Mountains last weekend. And, oh, did you go to see the Faraway Ranch at least? No, what's that? So it's a great, if you're a camper, if you love camping, I'm told it's a wonderful place to camp. People bring their RVs, but that's on the eastern side of the mountain of the National Monument, and this faraway ranch is on the west side. So David Laughlin's entire Buffalo Soldier collection is including the series of paintings I referred to called The Military Hours. 24 prints showing one for each hour of the day are being taken to the Buffalo Soldier Museum in Houston, Texas, to remain as a permanent collection. Finally, I am finishing the last chapter of my draft of a book tentatively entitled Buffalo Soldiers in Southern Arizona. They told us who they were and that they cared about James A. Garfield. And I plan to have that published next year. So the legacy of Garfield is more important, to me, it's more important today than ever. His words and beliefs about equal access to education and voting, spoken in the 1870s, are equally applicable today. Though some believe Garfield is one of the least remembered presidents, for some blacks, he may be the most remembered. Indeed, the patriarch of one black family, Caleb Baines Martin, a runaway slave from Mississippi, arrived with General George Crook at Fort Grant in 1871, serving as a cook for the officers. He named his firstborn son, William Garfield Martin, and his descendants have honored Garfield by giving a male child the middle name of Garfield in each of the succeeding 6 generations. They are currently dispersed all over the United States, from Chicago to Los Angeles. So Garfield's memory lives on in their family and continues to live on at the Chiricahua National Monument. So that's what I have. I'd love to answer questions. I put together, I only made 10 copies, but I have a little bibliography of some of the books that, if you have any interest in this, you might want to take a look at those books. The president of the Chiricahua Historical Society just wrote a very, not a really big one, but a good summary of where Geronimo was. I'm talking about Buffalo Soldiers, and his latest book was where was Geronimo in Mexico, and what was going on there in terms of his surrender. And it's really helped me. I knew nothing about the Apache Wars. Being from Michigan, we have, we have reservations and different tribes there. So I made a couple copies, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you, in your research, did you ever find any instances of the Buffalo Soldiers, I don't know how many of them were literate, as you said, did they ever have any misgivings or any feelings about the fact that they were a persecuted minority and their job as a Buffalo Soldier was to persecute another minority?
Right. I've been asked that question before. I have not, there's nothing in the record about that. They were soldiers. Some of them had only been emancipated 20 years, 15 years. They were looking for employment. I think if I saw there's a Buffalo Soldier movie or something I think I've seen, right? Maybe somebody's seen that. And people said to me when I was doing my research, oh, have you seen the movie? And so within the last year, I saw the movie, and the ending is right out of Hollywood, I think. Well, what would I expect? But no, there was no, I know you're persecuted, you're an enemy combatant at the time. There was no, I shouldn't be doing this. At least I haven't come across, I've done a lot of research on the Buffalo Soldiers, I haven't, yeah.
Just a question, the captain, like Cooper, some of the, obviously the officers that served there had to be literate.
Yeah.
Did you have any access to any papers, or they keep diaries or letters that they may have addressed in real time? I mean, obviously it took a lot of time and effort on this part of their soldiers. And we could inject, obviously,
Yeah.
they did it. But it would really be nice to hear if that
From them.
by them, what did they think, what did they say? I mean, it had to take a long time for them to...
Well, some of the officers, I have little bits and pieces from maybe a couple of the sergeants who would be literate. One of the doctors that traveled with them wrote something. So some of the white officers wrote, and that's helpful to see, you know, what their thoughts were. But, you know, there were, during this period of time, I mean, there were blacks who went to West Point. And altogether, there were 18 Medals of Honor awarded to the Buffalo soldiers. So they, you know, there was some literacy there, but there's so little written about, and the reason I picked this was because I'm a kind of human interest writer, and I like to write about people. And this particular part of history I didn't think would be told with the Garfield Monument and Bonita Canyon. So that's why I decided. But I could not find anything that they had written about this experience. Yeah. Yeah.
How long were they out? What was their length?
7 months.
Okay, but when did they leave?
Now, are you talking about this particular troop?
Yes.
They left May 1st, 1886, and they came in September of 1885. So they were there for a while. And then when they left, this was kind of interesting, 2 troops, H and E, left to go back to the fort, and Troop I came in. Because by the time when they left, Geronimo had not surrendered yet. So I came in January, and Geronimo surrendered in September. So you still had the Troop I there, but there were hardly any engravings from Troop I, so I couldn't tell you who those people were. I think there was one stone engraved from Troop I. Yes, sir.
The point about tearing down the monument to build a fireplace, it sounds insensitive. In an odd sort of way, didn't it create more people went to that restaurant, that establishment? Did it have more interest in asking about these stones and be more people interested or educated on it than if it was left out in the area where it was?
Are you saying would there have been more interest if it had been left there?
No.
No.
No, I mean, it's an isolated area. I don't know how many people would visit the monument where it was, but the fact it was in a restaurant where maybe more people would go and look at the wall and say, what does that mean, what is this? And then if someone explained it, it created more interest in the monument itself.
I think so. I mean, you mean when it was put around the fireplace? Yeah. And they had they had the governor of Arizona who came to the guest ranch. They had people from the East Coast, probably around here, maybe New York, who came out there because it was such a different experience. For them, they rode horses. And you know what? Had those stones not been put there, I don't know that we would even be talking today, right? So, I mean, really, Lillian, I am grateful to those Swedish homesteaders. And actually, her and her sister, as it turns out, were the first women to have a guest ranch in Arizona. So there you have another story. A lot of stories. Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask, did he do a lot of skirmishing with Geronimo while he was there? Was there a lot of conflict?
None. Well, Geronimo and his band were at the St. Carlos Reservation. They were on the reservation when the 10th Cavalry arrived. Within 2 weeks of them being there, Geronimo and maybe up to 50, 60 people left the reservation and went to Mexico. Now that was in May. And so Geronimo had left the reservation 3 times. And I think this is what, I think, you know, when you kind of see, you know, Washington taking one position, you know, just get him back on the reservation. At the time, they were still talking about just the reservation. By the time Geronimo surrendered, they were talking about people putting all of the Indians on a train and taking them to Florida, which is what they did. They didn't want to take a chance getting him back on the reservation and leaving for the 4th time. Now I will tell you, you know, my appreciation for Native American strategy, I know they were, you know, we were at war, but I have to tell you, they were quite strategic. And actually many of the generals had great respect for the Native Americans. They were the chiefs. Now, Geronimo was not a chief. He was not, and people, but there's so much written about him. There were others who were in hereditary line. He was not one of them, and he, you know, he lived a long time. You know, he went to Florida, and then he was allowed to go to Oklahoma, what was Indian Territory, and then he appeared in different kinds of world fairs or whatever. So he did. He lived a long time. He was not a chief. He was more of a shaman. He was a medicine man. Yeah. So it's a fascinating, for those, I'm from the Midwest. I spent my whole life in the Midwest. This has just been a fascinating experiment for me to see how much I can find out about the history of the area that I am. There are many Buffalo Soldier cemeteries, graves in the cemetery. So remember, in the beginning I told you about the soldiers along the Mexican border. Some of those soldiers stayed. This would have been after 1923, and married Mexican women. And now they have generations of children. There are descendants of the Buffalo Soldiers in the area, which is pretty cool, I think. So, you guys have been great. Thank you.